Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste friends. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss Marxist school of history writing, then a particular genre of history which is often known for its perspective as history from below, and then we will look at Neo-Cambridge school of history writing, which came in the late 1960s and 1970s. So, we will start with the basic tenets of Marxist historiography. This school of thought, as the name itself suggests, alludes to the writings and thoughts of Karl Marx. The crucial point which I would like to underscore here, which I would like to underline in today's presentation, is economic centric approach of historians who were otherwise broadly associating themselves within nationalist frame of history. So, to start with, this meant a shift of perspective and focus area from political history to economic centric understanding of both politics as well as economic aspects of life. So, it has twin dimensions. One, we will be discussing how a new interpretation of political events and processes are offered in this framework, and then how similar methodological and theoretical approach took the course of historiography away from the dominance of political history to economic history. In the core of Marxist framework lies the centrality of what has been termed as historical materialism. In very simple terms, this means a dynamic relation of social forces between base and superstructure. The framework establishes that while the ideas and elements of culture can be located at the level of superstructure, these or changes there has to be understood, or these changes are driven by changes in the base, and that base is in turn determined by primarily economic forces, both in terms of agencies as well as in terms of relationship of production. In terms of coinage, the word often used is mode of production. This mode of production entails three crucial aspects: means of production, method of production, and relationship of production. We will come to these aspects little later in detail, but this is the frame which Marxist understanding of society and social change offers. Now, given this frame, the first major historiographical intervention in the history writing on India is concerned came in 1946 by A.R. Desai, who wrote a PhD dissertation and later converted it into book titled Social Background of Indian Nationalism. In many ways, the publication of this book is hailed as a landmark intervention, a major departure on the history of nationalism in Indian context. For Desai, the major departure was in the conceptualization of nationalism itself. In the tradition of Marxist school, he argued that nationalism is not a primordial consciousness or ideology. He argued that nationalism is a historical category. This is not sui generis, rather it comes into being in a given historical social milieu. And in the historiography or scholarship even beyond history which look at nation and nationalism, there has been a constant debate among two major line of thoughts. One while argue that it's an organically developed ideology, a kind of primordial tie. The other believes that nationalism, like any other socio-historical concept, emerges in a specific historical context. And this emphasis on context, the historical milieu, is extremely crucial. A.R. Desai also briefly outlines the emergence of nationalism first in the context of 16th century Europe, Western Europe, and then he suggests that gradually nationalism expanded its domain and moved into other societies. The development of nationalism is preceded by decline of other pre-capitalist modes of society or pre-capitalist structures like Western European nationalism. A.R. Desai argues that Indian nationalism is also a modern phenomena. However, going back to my earlier formulation, which I just mentioned, that unlike historians of nationalism in Western Europe, the task for historians in colonies like India was always to explain why in Indian context there was no capitalism, yet nationalism emerged and progressed. This anomaly has been resolved by Marxist scholars in the manner in which, as Desai himself subscribes, and here it has been argued that nationalism is an ongoing project. There is no finality attached to it. So, it is always in process, and this is why many historical studies on Indian nationalism at one particular point of time, mainly in 1970s and 1980s, were either titled or were framed in a manner that nation was making. Nationalism, the making of nationalism, which was suggesting certain kind of continuity, certain kind of ongoing process, certain incompleteness in the process itself. Coming back to A.R. Desai and his treatment of social background of Indian nationalism, he briefly surveyed pre-colonial Indian society to argue that before the Britishers, there were structural obstacles in the growth of nationalism. This then led to the argument that the rise of nationalism in India was a byproduct of colonialism. Let us briefly look at his arguments about pre-colonial Indian society. Here, the core argument rests on his reading, or the reading which was prevalent at that time, about Indian village. From the scholarship of British colonial administrators like Henry Maine and others, who delved deep into explaining the core of Indian society in terms of self-sufficient villages which remained unchanged across the period till the arrival of Britishers. A.R. Desai also borrows this concept of self-sufficient, stagnant Indian village as the core unit of Indian society. And like his predecessors who looked at Indian villages, particularly this construct of self-sufficient Indian village, Desai also points out that in the course of history in India, while dynasties came and went away, kings changed, new elements came, yet this core village societies remained unchanged across centuries. These village societies remained unaffected by all the external changes, all changes taking place at broader level. Then he moves on to the phase of feudalism, and again, like the predominant Marxist views, he argued that in feudal structure the basic feature was decentralized units. Later on, in the writings of Indian historians, particularly Ramchand Sharma, who came up with his magna opus Indian Feudalism in 1965 or 66, we come across the similar model where decline of long distance trade and economy led to decline of urban centers, and these two were in turn preceded by decline of money economy and all these then led to development of isolated administrative units, and on the other hand the entire model rested on the hierarchy of ownership on the given piece of land. The point worth paying attention here in Desai's argument, and which is the link, is the simple fact that due to feudalism there was no possibility of linkages across different regions. So, there was no sense of pan Indian consciousness. However, unlike Western Europe, which witnessed decline of feudalism by 13th-14th century, and the period from 13th-14th century up to industrial revolution was known as a period of transition from feudalism to capitalism. Unlike this entire historical process which was taking place in Western Europe, India did not witness any such transition. The reason given in the context of India is that there was no individual property rights on land in India. As I just mentioned, in one of the core features of feudalism is hierarchy of rights, multiplicity of rights on the same piece of land. So, there never developed a clearly defined property rights over land. Land which occupies perhaps one of the most significant element in that equation of mode of production. This is perhaps the most crucial means of production, and in order to have transformation of agriculture from a backward feudal structure to capitalist structure. The transformation of land itself was the most crucial element. And in Western Europe in 16th century, because of a series of historical processes which we need not to venture into detail here for the simple reason of our scope of discussion. Here in Indian context, there was no enclosure system, and land as a commodity itself never acquired its status. All these pointed towards a situation where there was no national sentiment before the arrival of British. It was British policies which became responsible for a lot of changes, both at the level of village societies as well as at the level of each and every components which constitute mode of production. With the arrival of British and due to series of British policies which include their land revenue settlements, namely three: permanent settlement, Rayat Bari settlement and Mahal Bari settlements. There was a considerable change in the nature of land itself. Now, I must, before we proceed, I must mention a disclaimer that while I am engaging with Desai's argument and the broad arguments in terms of explication of many of these terms and their realities, I am also mobilizing later scholarships on all these issues. So, my explanation does not remain constrained by the logic of A.R. Desai's book. Yet the core argument, which I mentioned earlier also, is that history of the progressive British domination of India is therefore at the same time the history of the progressive transformation of the feudal economy of pre-British India into a capitalist economy, however imperfect and distorted. I am using these lines from A.R. Desai's book itself. As I just mentioned that British land revenue policies he recognizes as bringing change in the social relationship of self-sufficient villages in India. Along with this, the decline of artisanal industry, a phenomena which acquired the coinage of deindustrialization in later writings, shackled the core of artisanal and traditional manufacturing economy in India. Thus, both these aspects, the change in the agrarian structure as well as changes in the manufacturing sector, the artisanal economy at that time, led to the emergence of new classes on Indian horizon. For example, class of capitalists, industrial and transport workers, agricultural laborers, new types of merchants. Thus, in the words of Desai, British domination led to annihilation of old Asiatic society. There are long debates which followed in history after this seminal work on the similar lines, but going into the nitty-gritty, different nuances of this transformation. For example, group of scholars worked on land revenue system, and particularly in 1960s and for a major part of 1970s, this became a big obsession among economic historians. So was the concept of commercialization of agriculture, which at one point of time, particularly from mid 1970s onwards, became a huge debate in Indian academia, not merely in history, but also in historical sociology, economic history, etc. And these debates are commonsensically referred as mode of production debate. Here, while some scholars looked at land focusing on the complexities of means of production, others focused on aspects like method of production, whether machinization took place, the whole how explaining and engaging with the processes which led to change in the agriculture. Another third set of scholars, they focused and foregrounded the relationship of production, and there they were following seminal work done in context of Europe by people like Robert Brenner, where they emphasized that among the means of production, method of production, and relationship of production, scholars ought to focus more on the power dynamics, the relationship of different social elements engaged in agriculture. So, this debate went on and on. In Indian context, we can definitely suggest that A.R. Desai opened a new path, new vista of looking at Indian society and the questions of nationalism. Desai identifies, having cleared all these background, which we just had a glimpse of, Desai identifies 5 broad phases of nationalism in India. In the first phase, he argues that the social base was extremely narrow, and this was the phase which roughly correspond to the first half of 19th century, where an intelligentsia emerged which was itself product of Western education. This intelligentsia assimilated democratic ideas and outlook. For example, Ram Mohan Rai can be considered as one example of this intelligentsia. Their main concern was socio reform movement and to bring changes in society by inculcating and propagating liberal values. In this phase, the social base of nationalism remained quite constrained, quite limited. The base further expanded in the second phase, which Desai identifies with late 19th century, and here an educated middle class emerged. In this phase also emerged a class of industrial capitalists which had interest and investment in international trade. Otherwise, we refer to this phase as moderate phase. And we know the features of moderate politics, so we need not to again explain that. We earlier saw in detail the case of Dadabhai Naoroji and his critique of imperial economic policies. The point worth mentioning here in Desai's frame is his emphasis on the social base, social composition of these leaders. The third phase he identifies is from 1905 to 1918, a phase of political propaganda by extremists who instilled a sense of self confidence. They based their doctrines on the basis of what Desai calls mystic Hindu philosophy. They mystified, but also they limited the social base by alienating community of Muslims who felt alienated because of the idioms, the language of this discourse of extremists. Fourth phase he identifies is from 1918 to 1930-34. This is post World War phase, post World War I phase, where the economic interests broadened the political participation of Indian industrialists. Post war economic crisis was primarily responsible, which actually, unlike Europe, opened up new avenues for Indian industrial class, though there were fluctuations and the graph cannot be said homogeneous or linear. The point he emphasized in this period is while the Congress under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi broadened its social base and included hitherto ignored segment of society like peasants, workers, students into its fold, but there was an coming together of industrialist class and the Congress leadership to serve mutual interest. The leadership remained in the hands of bourgeois segment, and they served the interest of Indian capitalist class primarily. The fifth phase Desai identifies is from 1934 to 39, where a section within Congress lost faith in its own leadership. He particularly mentions Congress Socialist Party. Another feature was that the elements which had entered in the previous phase, elements like peasants and workers, they also soon started moving away from Congress, and we come across formation of organizations like Kisan Mahasabha, peasants parties and workers organizations started cropping up. This was the phase which witnessed independent Kisan movements in different parts of the country. Indian capitalist class further added to its economic and social strength during the World War II, and we must take into account here that the book came up in 1946, before India had attained freedom. So, towards the end of the book, he is almost a prophetic in his approach, and he suggests that on the basis of this history, what would be the likely course of Indian nationalism. And while in the fifth phase he says that a clear contradiction emerged, a conflict of interest emerged between the bourgeoisie, the leaders, and the followers. He writes that in the future this contradiction will sharpen and the dissatisfaction will further lead to conflict, and there would be ramifications for this in the form of communalism or other forms of violence and suppression. This is the larger structure which I have tried to present in a very simplified manner. Now, as I have also mentioned in passing, that this overarching frame has been used imaginatively, rigorously by generations of historians who adhered to Marxist ideology and Marxist frame of looking at history. And this investment has led to the production of very nuanced monographs, studies, detailed empirical accounts, and some of them we will have opportunity to deal with, discuss. For example, in 1960s the scholarship started engaging with the question of agriculture and peasantry, which then matured in mid 1970s, continued up to 1980s. So, economic history came to acquire certain maturity in these 3-4 decades and there the Marxist framework, questions, debates shaped the contour in no uncertain terms. From within this frame, by 1960s emerged set of writings which are known, which are distinguished by their emphasis on history from below. Another extremely crucial strand which came up from within Marxist tradition was called history from below. There the emphasis was not to focus on the leadership, but to look at hitherto ignored marginalized sections, chiefly peasantry, and then later on working class. This coinage first emerged in the historical scholarship on Western Europe, particularly in England, where social historians like E.P. Thompson, Hobsbawm, they were focusing on these marginal social elements, marginal in the sense that they were not earlier spoken about, written about. E.P. Thompson's work on working class is particularly noteworthy. Drawing insights from these works in Indian context, historians began to shift their focus away from Congress leadership to peasants and participation of workers. They started examining the relationship between the leader and the follower. This history of from below then also gradually developed as a fiercely debated terrain with lot of complex contestations and perspectives being offered. Many of these scholarships and this particular historiography we will deal in detail in our later lectures when we will talk about subaltern historiography, which came up from the initial years of 1980s. And then we will also talk in that context how subaltern historians distinguish themselves from the overall Marxist perspectives, Marxist historiography. Those will come later. The final point that I would like to mention here in context of our discussion on Marxist historiography is the strand where scholars harped on the development of underdevelopment in context of colonial economy. This coinage, development of underdevelopment, came from group of scholars, Marxists like Andre Gunder Frank, Samir Amin, who was particularly troubled by the fact that while capitalism developed in Western Europe, the class contradiction or the historical conditions of similar nature did not allow the development of capitalism in colonies. In order to answer this question why, they argued that capital behaves differently in mother country and colonies. While in mother country, sharpening capital, the growth of capitalism is associated with sharpening of the class contradiction and generation of surplus that ultimately led to capitalism. I am again putting the entire model very simply and crudely, just to make the ground clear. In colonies, this sharpening, this crystallization, this entire process actually led to the deepening of poverty and backwardness. This cycle of perpetual growth of underdevelopment was then explained in terms of the behavior of capital in the core and the margins. In Indian context, scholars use this model to argue why, despite having capitalist potentialities in British period, capitalism did not grow in India. The debate percolated and shaped historical scholarship at different levels. One of the grounds for this debate was 18th century Indian society, which was also known as Dark Age of decline, as Mughal Empire had its charm after death of Aurangzeb in 1707, and that arrested the economic development coupled with the arrival of British. But that is a debate we will revisit again later in some detail. Here I would like to end with mentioning that in the last 70 years, Marxist framework, even when we may identify various limitations, has actually deepened our understanding of colonial period and nationalist movement by grounding these historical experiences in specific socio-economic milieu. And this grounding has offered tremendous new ways of looking at Indian society and Indian history. Thank you.